This is episode 112 of the Magic Detective Podcast. On this episode, you'll hear about the life of the Great NICOla. That and more on this episode of the Magic Detective Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Magic Detective Podcast, your podcast home for magic history. I'm your host, Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective, and this is episode 112. So excited for today's podcast. But before we get there, if you haven't listened to episode 110 on Velma, Queen of Illusion, I encourage you to do so. She is one of the few, maybe the only person I've covered that is still living, but her story is so grand and awe-inspiring. If you were unaware, the entire podcast began when Sterling Lee was contacted by Velma. This then morphed into a recorded interview by Sterling and Judge Gary Brown. That interview next went to me to turn into a podcast. And then there's a next chapter, which is Sterling, Gary, and Charles Green went to visit Velma and had her listen to the podcast. And by all accounts, she really enjoyed the episode. And now there's even more positive things happening, but those I'll have to keep quiet about for the time being. Suffice to say, you may yet learn more about Velma in the future. Kreskin. Wow. You know, it's funny. I have been fascinated by all the different parts of magic my entire life. I've been a manipulator. I have been an illusionist, a stage magician, a close-up magician, a escape artist. But the one area that I've not really gotten into until recently was mentalism. It kind of all sort of began for me when a buddy of mine purchased the bulk of the Dunninger collection. There were pieces of Dunninger's props scattered all over the place, but there were kind of a bulk of things that some family members retained, and a friend of mine was able to purchase them. And we went through some of this stuff and seeing the actual items that Dunninger used in his show and seeing his tuxedo that he performed in and all this. What an incredible time that was to go through that and see it. And it just got me interested in Dunninger and in mentalism. And now, of course, there's Kreskin, who I personally saw live and in person several times. I never met him, but I did see him perform several times in person. And I always enjoyed his shows. Never really knew much about his methodology beyond maybe the card tricks that he did. He didn't seem to be part of the magic community, but I believe that was a bit of a smokescreen. I think he publicly avoided all references to magic or magicians, but privately he had many friends in the magic world, many associates in the magic world. And he was also an avid reader of all the latest books on magic. And of course, there is the Dunninger Kreskin controversy, which I'll save for another time. But just suffice to say, all these things, Kreskin and Dunninger, really helped to push my interest in mentalism. And then a couple years ago, a friend of mine from Virginia who had drifted from magic and really wasn't doing anything with it anymore called me up and gave me his collection of books, 98% of which were on mentalism. So I've really here lately been playing catch up on my knowledge of mentalism and loving every minute of it. It is so fascinating, just a great part of the magic world. And all that said, as a collector, I'm really interested in adding mentalists to my collection. I have a billet used by Joe Dunninger. Well, actually, it was Joe Dunninger's. It wasn't used as unused billet. I have 2 Dunninger posters. I have several programs and flyers used by Kreskin. I now have 3 books signed by Kreskin, 2 on hypnotism and 1 magic book. And as I stated last month, I would really like to find the person who purchased the suits and tuxedos from Kreskin during the last Potter and Potter auction. I'm only interested in getting one, just a single suit or tux. So if you're out there and you're willing to part with one of them, please let me know. Please contact me here. You can send me an email at info@carnegiemagic.com. I'd really appreciate that. And now, after all that mentalism jabber, it may come as a surprise that today's podcast is actually not about mentalism. Rather, it's about my favorite part of magic, illusions and illusionists. And once it was the kind of the highest form of magic, or at least certainly the highest paid performers were the illusionists. And now that's kind of fallen out of not really fallen out of favor, just fallen out of fashion, I think, to some extent. And I believe that's going to change soon. But anyway, today's episode is one about one of the great globetrotting magicians of the 20th century, the Great NICOla. Our story today starts in Ireland and Scotland with a man named Robert McNicol, who was the grandfather of our featured artist. He apparently was a magician in Scotland. Whether he only dabbed in it or was a full-time magician is unknown, but he shared his magic knowledge with his son, John, who changed the family name from McNicol to Nicol when he came to America. For a time, John performed as the Great NICOLA, adding an I to the end of his name. He was an occasional performer, but his full-time job was as a photographer. This was in the 1880s in the Midwest of America, where he and his family finally settled in Monmouth, Illinois. John Nichols had a son, William Mozart, who was born December 14th, 1880, in Burlington, Iowa. In truth, he had two sons and a daughter. The first son was Charles, born in 1871, and the daughter, named Maud, was actually the first child, born in 1869. From Milbourne Christopher's book, The Illustrated History of Magic, we learn that young Will Nicol assisted his father with magic from time to time. This is where he learned his craft. The older brother Charles also assisted his father in magic, but more on him later. In the year 1898, the Trans-Mississippian International Exhibition was held in Omaha, Nebraska. The older brother Charles, who had followed in his father's footsteps to become a photographer, went to the event to set up a concession stand. The younger brother went along as well, and this is where destiny stepped in. From the pages of The Bat magazine, 1948, we learn that a chance encounter with someone from the exhibition who asked Will if he knew anything about magic, and the next thing you know, a star was born. Okay, well, maybe not a star, but it was young Will, and his first chance at a professional gig. And for the first time, he chose the name Nicola, Prince of Magic. He presented a pretty standard act with billiard balls, linking rings, rising cards, and similar items, all things that he learned from his father. But this gig did two things. It made him realize he could do magic professionally, and it gave him a lot of flight time, or time on stage in front of a live audience. The more you're in front of an audience, the better your material becomes. One other thing of note, during the Trans-Mississippi exhibition in Omaha, Will met Ching-Ling Fu for the first time. They would remain lifelong friends. I covered Ching-Ling Fu, by the way, in episode 81 of the podcast, if you'd like to check that out. From this, he went across country to Baltimore to set sail for France and the international exhibition in Paris. In Paris, he met up with a fellow neighbor from Monmouth, who, as it turns out, was a popular dancer named Louis Fuller. She helped Nicola get a gig at the Theatre Egyptian, where he would perform a silent act in a revue show, and this lasted for almost 6 months. Upon completion of his run, he returned to the United States, now a much more seasoned performer. From the pages of Magic, A Pictorial History of Conjurers in the Theater by David Price, we learn that Will soon began to work for the Lyceum Circuit, presenting a much longer show. Now, I need to backtrack slightly. Will's older brother, Charles, was also a magician and also a photographer like his father. You'll recall he went to the exhibition in Omaha to set up a photo booth. But prior to that, in 1892, Al began performing as Nicola, the same name the father used, the same name the other son, Will, was using. He would do the occasional date, but then it appears he moved into the Lyceum Circuit and over time presented as many as 3,000 shows. And I'm assuming it was the older brother who got Will into the Lyceum circuit, as Al had moved on to performing at theaters. In 1903, Will Nicol changed his name from Nicoli to Nicola. Now, Nicola may have started out with some standard tricks, but he changed dramatically over time. One of the things he added were escapes, and much like Houdini, well, exactly as Houdini, he did all manner of escapes, from handcuffed bridge jumps to jail escapes. These were used as publicities, just like Houdini had done, and they had the same effect. They brought in the crowds and the ticket-buying public. And that wasn't all. Nicola also began to add illusions to his show. An illusion he presented, which is never seen these days, is called the sleeping miracle of strength. In this wonderful effect, Nicola hypnotizes a young lady who's sitting in a chair. And to demonstrate the power of hypnosis, he requests that she stretch out her arms to the side. And then 2 large 100-pound weights on large rings are lifted up and placed on the woman's outstretched arms. Despite the amount of weight, her arms do not lower an inch, and she's able to hold onto these large weights in place without moving via hypnosis. Or so we're led to believe. As time went by, Will became the more popular performer. When it became time to do a world tour, the older brother Charles joined the show behind the curtain. The world tour began officially in 1910 and started in Hawaii, but not without problems. Their first scheduled stop was Honolulu, and when they arrived, their theater was gone. It sort of disappeared a few days earlier due to a fire. The only theater in town was occupied, and those people had no intention of leaving. The Nicola troupe told the other show they would set up across the street in an empty lot. They would erect a tent to do the show, and before you know it, that show decided, well, they would move on to the next leg of their tour if Nicola would pay the transportation costs. Deal. And by the way, there never was a tent, it was merely a bluff. The Hawaiian shows were a hit both financially and otherwise. Next stop on the tour would be Japan and then on to China. In Shanghai, Nicola did incredible business. He was the first American performer to appear in China, but things once again hit a snag in Peking, which is modern-day Beijing. The problem, no theater was large enough to hold his show and an audience. So, Nicola took a crazy risk and had a theater built. 600 workers were hired, working around the clock. The workers built a bamboo theater large enough to house 3,000 people. It only took 5 days. Can you imagine the building inspectors looking over this thing today? By all accounts, the show was a big hit on the road. In fact, it was so popular that Nicola had his brother Charles take out another show of his own, but this time performing under the stage name Van Arks. Nicola also ran into his old buddy Ching-Ling Fu, who was even a featured guest artist in the show at one occasion. The tour continued throughout the surrounding areas, into India, over to Australia. Nicola ventured to South Africa and then over to South America. David Price's book Magic points out that Nicola's arrival corresponded with Teddy Roosevelt's arrival in Rio de Janeiro. Many spectators carried signs with "Welcome Teddy" on one side of the sign and "Welcome Nicola" on the other. No doubt the work of a smart-thinking publicity man. On the other side of the globe, Von Arx was not having an easy run. Difficulties would plague the show. When they got to Calcutta, they ran into a brand new problem. The war had broken out, and by this point, India, by the way, which was part of the British Empire, had a problem with Von Arx because his name sounded German to the public and to the authorities. And one of the features in the Von Arx show was a bullet-catching feat. The authorities confiscated his gun on numerous occasions, and the last time they confiscated his gun, it was not returned. But that was only the start. Imagine being on a world tour and you get arrested. This happened to Von Arx in Rangoon, and he was locked up for 9 months. When he was finally released, he took only a small trunk of apparatus to be able to perform with. The rest of the show stayed behind, and one of the things he did was change his name from von Arx to Chalbert. This combined his first name Charles and his middle name Albert. He had moderate success in the Philippines, and then his stuff was sent off to Shanghai. It took an unusual amount of time to arrive, and when it did, he discovered the props, the wooden props, had mostly been destroyed by termites. He was able to scrounge up enough material to do a show, and at the end of the run, he returned to America. In July 1914, war was breaking out all over Europe, and Nicola, who was in South America, returned to the United States. By 1916, he was heading back to the Pacific, this time adding Korea to his tour, as well as China and India. An interesting note, during World War I, he created a poster for his tour which had him sitting and pointing outwards, with the words on the poster which read, "I want you to see my Nicola show," a takeoff on the popular Uncle Sam recruiting poster used during World War I. Historian David Charvet put together a fine booklet called The Great NICOLA, Monmouth's Globe-Trotting Magician. In there, I discovered that along with touring, Nicola had what we would call today a side hustle. This was importing exotic animals for zoos in America. He even brought back goldfish, half of which died on the return to the U.S., but he sold enough to bring in what would be $42,000 in today's money. After the war in 1918, Nicola and Chalbert, his brother Charles, teamed up again to go to Europe and entertain the troops. And one of his latest features was the hanging straitjacket escape, which he would do to promote the show. During one of his appearances, he hung upside down in a straitjacket from a military balloon, and if I might add, successfully escaped. The European tour was a smaller show. The illusions were left behind, but they still put on a grand program. And I can't tell if it was the name of the show or just a publicity angle that was used, but some of the promo featured this, "Nicola to be hanged," printed on it. This was referring to the upside-down straitjacket escapes. In some places, this single stunt wreaked havoc on local traffic, but it brought in huge returns for Nicola and company. To promote his shows, Nicola had a large amount of full-color lithos and other posters. One featured his spike illusion, where a woman was pierced by a bed of spikes in a vertical position. This was called the Iron Maiden. Another illusion he presented was the Elastic Lady, a beast of an illusion due to its enormous size. This is an illusion where a woman is placed in a gigantic box with her head poking out and her hands and her feet poking out as well. And the magician stretches her arms or her hands very, very far apart. Then her feet are pulled very far apart. And finally, her head is moved up and down in a very extreme way. Today, there are smaller versions of this particular illusion, but honestly, I have seen this particular effect presented, and it's fantastic. It's not really a practical trick because it's really, really big, but it is visually a winner. Nicola presented something called Seeing Through a Woman. On the poster, it looks devilish for sure, but I have a feeling it's a version of Girl Without a Middle. On the posters, there's no box, but they show the cutting in an illustration of the girl and also an illustration without her entire middle section, it being gone. Is that false advertising or just artistic license? I don't know. In 1923, Nicola and company narrowly escaped death when in September an earthquake shook Japan. They were on board a ship in the harbor when the earthquake hit. He did lose his advance man, and over 140,000 people died during this event. In 1924, Nicola was back in the States, this time picking some of his best effects to do a 30-minute vaudeville show. Opening the show was his Stack of Box production, where 6 large boxes, each bearing a letter from his name. They were stacked one upon the other, slowly spelling Nicola. As the final box went into place, Nicola himself came walking out from within the stack. He even presented his show on the huge Hippodrome stage in New York City. I bet that elastic lady illusion played incredibly well on that huge stage. Another illusion that dated back to his earlier days was known as the Astral Bride. Depicted on the posters was a lady sitting on a table. After being covered, she vanished, and then a wooden crate that had been hanging in full view the entire time was lowered onto the stage. This was actually a nest of boxes, and the final box, within the final box was found the previously vanished lady. The main prop used to vanish the lady was something called a sedan chair, not a particularly good vanish, but probably fine for the time. From the pages of the Illustrated History of Magic by Milbourne Christopher, we learn his most publicized illusion was the vanishing elephant. The book says, quote, Nizi, the elephant, weighed a mere 600 pounds. Nicola told reporters that he started out with a full-grown elephant, but each time Nizi disappeared, a few pounds work off. And she was now a shadow of her former self, unquote. In 1926, he suffered another big setback when a warehouse fire destroyed a large portion of his theatrical props. These, however, were items not currently being used in the show, so he was able to survive this particular disaster. From 1926 to 1928, they toured America in vaudeville theaters. In 1929, it was back on the road, heading to Australia. And he avoided the stock market crash of 1929, as all of his money was invested not in stocks, but rather in his show. And he was out of the country, so he didn't really suffer from it. This was his third and most prosperous tour yet. In the 1930s, he was back in the United States, touring with a large show. Despite the hardships created by the Depression, Nicola was still selling out entire theaters. By this point, Nicola's show was easily one of the largest in the world. He had 50 tons of equipment. Traveling with it required 2 large freight cars, which I assume were freight train cars. The Nicola show often included other acts, smaller acts that appeared between illusions and also helped out in parts of the show. In 1938, Will married his longtime chief assistant, Marion Eddings. She'd worked in the Nicola show for 17 years. A short time after the wedding and honeymoon, it was time to hit the road again, this time the 4th international tour. However, this time the tour would be affected by war in Europe breaking out again. This would be World War II. This caused the cancellation of a number of gigs. Nicola loaded his show on board a British ship called the Sardana, and on November 13th, 1939, the ship carrying his entire show hit a mine. The Sardana sank to the bottom of Singapore Bay. The crew and all their belongings were able to get off the boat before it sank, but everything else, props, illusions, theatrical scenery, was lost. And that would be the equivalent of over a loss of $2 million in today's money. He and Marion stayed behind in Singapore with the hopes of being able to maybe retrieve some of his illusions at some point. The rest of the crew was sent home to America. After 6 months of pleading, however, Nicola finally gave up the effort and returned home. His big show was effectively gone. He had no insurance on this particular tour, so all his life's work vanished into the night. He did have a few things in Monmouth, but the majority lay in the bottom of the bay. When he returned to the States, he began to work on a new show that he could take to entertain the troops. World War II was now in full force. To assist even further in the war effort, he donated much of his remaining props that were made of metal. His milk can, his handcuffs, and more were melted down and used to make weapons for the war. Around 1944, at the age of 62, Will Nicola's health began to be a problem. He had to slow down tremendously. He suffered for 2 years until he died on February 1st, 1946, from a heart attack. Will Nicola, the last of the globetrotting illusionists, was gone. As great as the story was, I kind of feel like barely scratched the surface. There are many adventures that I've left out, and I understand from my research that collector Tad Ware has much of Nicola's documents and correspondence that were given to him by Marion for a proposed book on Nicola in the future. And to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, no such book has been completed. If I'm wrong and there is a Nicola book out there, please let me know, because I would be interested in finding a copy from somewhere. In fact, the funny thing about that, years ago when I first read about Nicola from the pages of the Illustrated History of Magic, I thought way back then, maybe someday I'll write a book on Nicola, but it seems this monumental task belongs to another. One thing for sure, every magician has a story to tell, and Nicola's story is so rich and fantastic. I'll be honest, I think it would make a great movie. Earthquakes, fires, shipwrecks, world tours, world wars, and yet Nicola survived it all. His show sadly didn't, but he certainly left an amazing mark on the world of magic. And that, my friends, is the story of Will Nicola, Prince of Magic, international world touring illusionist. Now, I'd like to add, in recent years, the Warren County History Museum in Nicola's hometown has been putting on what they call the Great NICOLA Magic Festival. This year, it takes place September 26th and 27th in Monmouth, Illinois, and you can find more about that by going to wchistorymuseum.com. And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Magic Detective Podcast. If you like this episode, please like it in any way that your podcasting provider allows. If you feel so inclined to give me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, that surely would be appreciated as well. By the way, just a reminder from last month, I mentioned it earlier, I'm still looking for the person who purchased the Kreskin jackets. If that's you, please email me at info@carnegiemagic.com. Next time around, I will be talking about the life of comedy magician Tommy Cooper. Until then, I'm Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective. Please be well and stay safe.